Welcome to the Zain Battla podcast. If you know me, you know I'm a person who loves conversations, whether it's about passions or ideas or current events. If you don't know me personally, then maybe you'll figure out that I'm not really a subject matter expert in anything, but I do consider myself a person who knows a little bit about a lot of things. I want to take you on this journey with me of continuing to learn. In the beginning, I'm going to be bringing guests within my network, and as a Muslim American, a lot of people will be coming from that community. I hope that you continue to join me on this journey, and I want to thank you for listening. My guest today is Ahmad Saad. Ahmad is an Egyptian American writer based in Chicago. He has a political newsletter titled Mourning, which you can subscribe to on Substack. He's an avid soccer fan, an outdoorsy guy, and he's a union organizer. Since I moved here 2 years ago to Chicago, Ahmad and I have had continuous conversations about the crumbling society around us, and I knew he was a perfect first guest for this episode. So thank you for listening, and I hope we can all get something out of our conversation today. Ahmad Saad, it's a pleasure to have you on the first episode of the Zain Battla podcast. Honored to have you as not just my first guest, but a guest in general.
It's a privilege to be here, honestly.
So my goal with the podcast is to just have guests on that I feel have a lot of good takes or interesting passions or ideas that should be discussed, whether it's something in the creative space, whether it's entrepreneurship, or in your case, writing.
Mm-hmm.
So you've been having this newsletter, Mourning. I'd love to hear more about your newsletter and how long you've been doing it. What's your inspiration?
Yeah.
So would love to hear about it.
For sure. So it's called Mourning, like you said. Mourning spelled Mourning, because we're documenting the decline of the Western Empire in real time. So it's there's some jokes, of course, but a lot of it is heavier things that might be reported on in mainstream media, but might not be highlighted. And the whole goal of it is for it to be, short, concise, digestible. So top to bottom, you're able to read a daily entry in maybe 5 minutes or less. And a lot of times, the things I'm writing about are things that are already in the headlines or things that people are, at least somewhat aware of. But a lot of times it's through a lens that's a bit different from the quote unquote objective lens that mainstream media aims for, which is something that was a big part of my inspiration. When I first started writing it, initially I was reading, the New York Times has a daily newsletter that they publish called Mourning, but like the opposite of night. And in it, as I was reading it day after day, I started to recognize that the coverage was not what I would call impartial or objective, which is, allegedly what they aim for. And specifically, I started it in, I think, August of 2022. And there was, maybe some sort of conflict in the Middle East that was unfolding. And I noticed that the coverage that I was reading in the New York Times was not aligning with what I knew to be true. So I thought to myself, okay, why not just try and write something that I recognize as true from my point of view? And if people want to read it, absolutely, that's fine, that's great. But it really was, at its inception, just sort of like a journal, something that I could look back on day to day and say, oh, this is what happened on this day, or this is what was big in the news in, August of 2022. And since then, it's kind of evolved into what it is today, which is, again, a daily newsletter that is focused on providing some varied coverage beyond just one specific outlet or one country's outlet, for the readership to be able to educate themselves. And I do my best within the different posts to include the links for wherever I'm getting information, or if it's an individual journalist, kind of providing a link to their work so that people don't have to just take my word for it. Mm-hmm. And in the words of the Republicans, they can do their own research.
So in a way, it's being able to provide objective news to those who are subscribed to your newsletter, but also in providing your commentary, which is the subjective part of the newsletter.
Well, I'll tell you, I definitely am not aiming for objectivity. I don't think a journalist's job is to be objective. I think a journalist's job is to tell what's happening in front of them. And if that carries with it some bias, I don't see an issue with that. I think one of the main issues I have with a lot of Western media is this desire or this commitment to quote unquote objectivity. This idea that, well, both sides have a fair claim to this narrative, when in actuality, like, there is right and there is wrong. And I don't see anything wrong with pointing that out or calling it out. In some cases, it's much more obvious than in others. And sometimes we do have to read between the lines or do a little bit more research. But as a readership or as an audience, I think that's the onus. The onus is on us. If one outlet isn't providing the whole picture, yeah, maybe reading a second or a third outlet or being able to expand our horizons beyond what mainstream media might be providing.
Well, I think some may say that the news that is exposed in mainstream media tends to be pretty subjective, in the sense that it is in the interests of, the corporate elites and those people in power, Fox News being the right wing of that, neo-conservative bubble, and then MSNBC, CNN being the neoliberal wing of that corporate bubble. So some may argue that news in general is supposed to be objective. And you're saying that, oh, well, it's not the news's job to be objective because it already is, and it's just stating the facts, and journalists should provide their opinion. So I guess what I'm trying to understand by you saying that is, isn't the media already subjective with its narratives?
Yeah, I would agree. I think there's a big disparity between what the media should be and what the media is. So when we talk about speaking truth to power, the difficulty there is that a lot of these outlets that you just mentioned, for example, their truth is decided by the people in power. So when we look at Western politicians or elected representatives, they're the ones who determine how we frame a certain story, or who's the victim, or who's the oppressor, or this and that. So it really it requires a little bit more effort than just opening a newspaper or pulling up a website and saying, oh, I'm going to trust whatever these journalists have to say. These journalists have a vested interest, or they've been invested by a lot of powerful backers, whether that's politicians, corporates, etc. So I think it takes a little bit more, like I said, effort in order to decipher between what is actually happening on the ground somewhere versus what is being reported 1,000 miles away.
Well, it's good that you bring that up, because today is November 7th. About exactly a month ago, is when the October 7th attacks, quote unquote, if you want to say attacks, uprising, whatever words you want to use. But since that month, you've been on top of reporting not firsthand, but secondhand about what's happening in Palestine, informing those that, clearly there's some war crimes that are occurring. Israel is committing war crimes. The U.S. is not really doing anything. The Congress members, they're all sitting on their hands.
Sorry, I got to interrupt.
What are we going to do?
I got to push back on that. It's not that the U.S. isn't doing anything. The U.S. is endorsing and funding and supporting every one of these war crimes. So to suggest, even for a moment, that the U.S. is, just a casual observer, not at all. The U.S. is the number one financier. The U.S. is the number one supporter. The U.S. is the number one endorser. None of what's happened in the last month happens without the U.S.'s say-so. So us sitting here in the belly of the beast in the U.S., I think it's very important to call this out and to point out that, okay, even though this is happening thousands of miles away, even though this might be happening to people that you or I don't know personally, it is important to point out and say, hey, it might not be totally unbiased when we read mainstream outlets here in the U.S.,
right?
Because a lot of the financiers behind these outlets are the same financiers that are, providing ammunition or weaponry that's falling on innocent people in Gaza.
No, agreed. And I guess I meant to say, essentially, they're not doing anything regarding the humanitarian aid of the people in Gaza, but definitely in terms of, fueling and propagating the attacks that Israel is doing on Gaza directly. United States is definitely at fault, and part of the problem, that our tax dollars that we're paying are being given to Israel. The first thing that the United States Congress did when they finally selected their new speaker is, write a $14 billion check to Israel. When President Obama was in office, he signed the $3.8 billion a year deal to
for
Israel.
10 years, yeah.
For 10 years. So,
and then it's interesting because Obama, even recently, a couple of days ago, hopped on a podcast similar to this one.
That'll be my next guest, actually.
But on his podcast, he put in a lot of effort to point out that, all of us here in the West, all of us here in the U.S. are complicit, which may be true. I pay taxes, I live in the U.S., I've lived in the U.S. most of my life, but to suggest that all of us are equally complicit, I think is a little disingenuous. Only one of us, between me and Obama, was president. Only one of us signed that military aid package you talk about. Only one of us normalized relations with an apartheid state. It's not me. So I can sit here comfortably, or a little bit more comfortably than someone like Barack Obama, and say that, okay, the efforts that I'm putting in to roll back these normalizations or these concessions that are going towards Israel, I can try and sleep comfortably at night. Obama, I can't really speak to how he sleeps at night. That's between him and God.
Yeah, and I mean, these are, important sides of the story, whether it's Obama or Amy Schumer or anybody who's, has a voice, whether it's a good voice or a bad voice. I think your voice is very important in all of this with your newsletter because, ever since I subscribed, I've been getting a lot of information on, the daily events that are happening throughout the world. And especially within the past month, it's been a constant updates that you've been giving on how many deaths there are on Palestine, when the ground invasion started, when what conversations have been happening between the United Nations and with other countries. What's their stance on all of this? So that's one thing that I've really enjoyed about the newsletter in general, because it's kind of a privilege to say that, some people are just too busy to make this, the forefront of their daily life. But getting those bullets, getting it, the topics, the subjects, the headlines, essentially kind of in a more condensed format and giving your feedback to it, it makes things a little bit easier to know what's happening in the world, especially with this conflict.
Yeah, I think one of the issues, or one of the hallmarks of this conflict, if we want to call it a conflict, is that a lot of times people will kind of refer back to, it's complicated, it's so nuanced, it's so complex, there's a lot going on, there's so much history, which is true. I mean, this isn't something that started a month ago necessarily. This is something that's been happening for many decades. But I disagree with the assertion that it's complex or it's nuanced. There are details, of course, that extend beyond what's happened in the past month, but there's nothing complicated about a genocide. Like, when we sit here and try and make excuses or try and defend in the West what Israel's been doing for obviously the last month, but for many years before that, I think people are kind of deluding themselves into making something more complex than it is. When 4,000 plus children have died in a month, there's nothing complex about that. Like, when I say ceasefire now, or when somebody's calling for an immediate ceasefire, it's with the thought of these 4,000 children in mind. It's not because we think, all of the problems will be solved and everything will be smoothed over and, everybody will live in harmony. No, but it is the thought that, okay, if we can enforce a ceasefire today, that means that all of the children that died today will not have died. If we can enforce it yesterday, that means all of the kids that died yesterday will not have died. So always with that in mind, moving towards trying to provide, certainly not an unbiased, I never claim to be unbiased in my coverage, but hopefully providing a clear picture as to why, when I say it's not complicated, that's where I'm coming from.
Got it. No, that's a good outlook, because even in, for example, your newsletter today, you were quoting Joe Biden, who said that based on Israel's population, this is essentially 15 9/11s proportionate to their population based on the amount of deaths that happened on the Israeli side. And then you also mentioned that if you do the same comparison for Gaza, it's 400 9/11s.
Right.
And this is what the media is not talking about. And
well, 400 9/11s, not just on any population, but on a besieged population that has no way of getting out. So
Right.
I laugh, but it's not anything humorous. Like, these are people that have been trapped in the same place with no recourse for exiting or no recourse for changing their circumstances for 16 years. And before that, they were also oppressed, and before that, they were also under systems of apartheid that have been in place for decades. So it is interesting the way that Joe Biden is, and not just Joe Biden, but many Western leaders are so prepared to compare what's happened in Israel a month ago to 9/11, or kind of the latest national tragedy in the U.S., and trusting, of course, the numbers that come out of Israeli media and this and that, but then calling into question the death counts in Palestine, or how many children exactly have passed away in the last month, which again really just speaks to the level of complicity that a lot of these Western leaders, they have blood on their hands.
Yeah, and I think the most surprising thing for me in the media, I mean, it's not surprising, but it's just to what extent are these politicians, are the media going to continue to defend Israel's actions? Because before October 7th, there was I guess, majority of people may have been a bit more uninformed on the occupation, how the U.S. gives money to Israel every year, how they fund essentially their weapons and the overall apartheid and occupation of the Palestinians. But now, more and more people are getting informed, more and more people are protesting and seeing that the U.S. is essentially complicit in all of this.
Absolutely.
So do you think that the tide is essentially turning, maybe not in the mainstream media, but more so in the general population?
Yeah, I think you have a very good point in saying that people are starting to have their eyes opened. As we mentioned, nothing that's happened in the last month is new. It's only just an escalation. Things have gotten much worse, certainly in the last month. But before that, people were dying, and people were being tortured, and people were being unjustly imprisoned regularly. And many people in the U.S., it wasn't a top priority, or it wasn't a thought that crossed their minds of, oh, I wonder what the details of this relationship between Palestine and Israel are.
Right.
So I do think the tide is turning in that way, in that people are really starting to open their eyes and think about, why is it that Israel has always been the number one recipient of foreign aid from the U.S.? And why is it that the U.S. is so kind of consistent in backing Israel and so adamant about Israel's quote-unquote right to exist? I think if your right to exist is, reliant on killing thousands of children a month, personally, I call into question, a right to exist with that as the price. But again, I don't think for a moment that what I write is going to change policy or change the mind of a politician. In the same way that I don't think, attending a protest or a rally is going to be the kind of motivating factor for Joe Biden or for anybody in power to change their mind. But I do think it is important in changing an individual mind. So in changing, the people around us, our friends, our family, our colleagues, the people that we work with, those are the people that are accessible. Those are the people that we can talk to on a day-to-day basis and give them a better idea, if they're interested, in learning about, what exactly is happening and why is it that maybe we shouldn't take everything that the New York Times says, as fact.
Yeah, and I think a good reason for all of this is how social media has essentially informed a lot of people on, hey, everything you're reading on Wall Street or Wall Street Journal, or what you're reading on New York Times or New York Post, whatever you're reading, question it. Don't just sit there and think that the information that you're being fed is correct. The only thing that maybe I would love your opinion on is, because of social media, because of TikTok, because of Twitter, a lot of people are, X, a lot of people are getting their information from these social media platforms, whether it's a credible user, whether it's someone completely random, things go viral, videos go viral. But you being someone who does a newsletter where you basically summarize the news or summarize the talking points, how do you validate what you're being fed either on social media or even on your newsletter is true, or that your criticism is valid?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And I think primarily one big difference between my style of writing or reporting, if you want to call it that, versus a major outlet is that so many of these major outlets really focus on being the first to report something. I'm not really interested in being the first to report something. I would rather it be verified. God knows the number of times in the last month that something has been reported. For example, the New York Times talking about 40 beheaded babies, or Joe Biden talking about seeing pictures of beheaded babies, only for a day later or a week later or a month later, the retraction comes out and they say, well, actually, we're not entirely certain if the babies were beheaded or how many there were or whose babies they were or what exactly happened. So I'm not interested in being the first to the news, but I am interested in whatever it is that I'm reporting, there is something verified.
It definitely seems like if there is something that, whether it's something that's, I guess, that needs more digging or more information, these news outlets, they tend to push it out. They want to be the first person to, or first media company to report on a specific news, or even celebrity death like Matthew Perry recently. It was just like, oh, we want to be the first one to report that competition constantly. And then when something isn't, needs to be corrected, or when the news outlet seriously made a mistake, they just quietly correct it. They'll put 10 articles about what they thought was correct or what they thought the answer was, which is why that beheaded babies narrative just flooded all the news outlets. Everybody was reporting on it. But when it came to correcting it, you didn't hear a peep from anybody.
Crickets, yeah.
Or even if you say, hey, you guys said this, or even if it's not the babies, it's a different topic in the past. Anytime there's some sort of correction, it's like maybe they'll just do a small little article on, hey, actually, we made a mistake, but they'll put it at the very bottom. They'll make one article, but they had 100 articles about the mistakes. And what's stuck in people's head is when they made the mistake.
Yeah.
And that's how people will continue to still make claims based on the mistakes, which is also the same reason why I brought up the whole social media point, because obviously, who am I to just tweet something or post something and someone, sees me as a reliable source, a reliable person giving information. But I think how social media has transformed, especially with the journalists on the ground in Gaza, is they're posting these videos. They're posting the videos of the kids who are dead, the ones that are injured, the hospitals that have blown up, the refugee camps that have blown up. And it's a lot of connecting the dots. Even if you're someone who hasn't been informed on the Palestinian occupation, essentially, or occupation by Israel, even if you haven't been informed, you start connecting the dots. And that's why maybe we're all in this bubble that, oh yeah, the tide is definitely turning. We'll have a free Palestine tomorrow. But it very well could be that, maybe we're just in this bubble, and the people that you follow, you tend to be like-minded. And now social media all has algorithms that you're going to see only content that, you would like to see.
The echo chamber effect is definitely ever present in social media. And I think you have a point in saying that social media has kind of leveled the playing field where, 10 years ago or 15 years ago or 100 years ago, there were a handful of outlets that people turned to for their news, and that was the end of the story. You trust what you trust, you like a certain outlet or a certain writer or a certain journalist, and you kind of take their word as truth. Now, for better or worse, we have people that are on the ground, whether it's in Gaza, whether it's in Sudan, whether, around the world, people that can provide a clear image or a clear idea of what is actually unfolding on the ground. And then, when people digest that or when people take it in, it's for them to determine, okay, this is something that I believe is verifiable. This is something that I don't really believe is, unfolding in the way that it's being reported. But now the onus is on us as opposed to being on the outlets. And unfortunately, I do think that a lot of the major outlets, the bigger, the ones that have a larger reach, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, you name it, if it's a Western outlet, many of them have kind of buckled under that pressure. And instead of focusing on, providing facts of what's on the ground, they really are taking more into account what their investors or what their financiers are saying.
Yeah, and I mean, what your newsletter tends to highlight a lot, and I think even when we have conversations, is just an attack on capitalism, attack on corporatism. You don't have any sympathy for the elites and the billionaires who, they just worked hard for their money, so they should be able to keep it, right? So I think that narrative you tackle on it a lot, and it's a revolving theme. So how do we reprogram our brains as Americans? We have this very capitalistic mindset that you work hard. How much money essentially equates to how hard you have worked, right? That's what a lot of people think of as the American mindset. They think that, oh, just because Jeff Bezos is worth billions or Elon is worth billions, it's all their money that they have, they deserve it.
Right.
Whereas more so from a either socialist lens or democratic socialist lens, whatever you want to call it. And I know, maybe this will get into words and verbiage because you like to highlight that a lot. But how do we make it easier to digest for the average person, not the 1%, because, they're definitely going to favor capitalism,
Lost cause.
but the other 99%, how do we open them up to thinking outside of the lens of capitalism?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a slow and steady process. Like, there are people that I'm friends with, people that I've followed for a long time, who for them it is very much, we have to run against capitalism in every facet that we can. Which, more power to them, but I understand that we live in a society that's deeply steeped in unfettered capitalism, and it's been that way for many years. So to have an anti-capitalist lens or a socialist lens or a communist lens is really difficult in American society today. I think my focus is on the incremental change away from kind of focusing everything solely on capitalism. So I can recognize that if someone works hard, they deserve to earn an amount of money that provides them with I don't want to say luxury necessarily, but yeah, comfort. But if that comfort is coming at the expense of workers or the people that are below that person in the company, for example, it's worth questioning. And that's all I'm interested in doing at this point, is asking those questions and having people think them over. So whether or not we need, the United States to shift away from capitalism in the 2024 election, I'm not the guy to answer that question. I don't have those answers.
Damn.
But yeah, sorry to disappoint.
You have the answers.
But I do think it's worth asking the questions of, okay, well, why is it that someone like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or whoever has hoarded so much wealth, has amassed so much capital to reach a point where they can own news outlets or they can own multiple billion-dollar companies and just be the figurehead behind them. I think a lot of the issues that we've mentioned so far, even when we talk about mainstream media and how it's kind of required to report a certain style of narrative or required to highlight a certain kind of narrative, a lot of that issue traces back, in my opinion, to capitalism. The fact that a lot of news is based on the amount of clicks or the amount of views that something might get. So in order to get those views, you have to be the first to report something, even if it's not verified.
Yeah.
That, to me, is a product of a capitalist system that's trickled down to reach our news and the way that we view the things that are happening day to day.
Views equal money.
That's right. So I don't think, from my perspective, at this point in my life, I can be anti-capitalist, of course, but I don't delude myself into thinking that I'm going to change capitalism as an ideology or as a dominating force in this country. But even operating within capitalism, there are things that you and I can do day to day that can help shift, like I said, that incremental change that we're looking for.
Yeah.
So when we talk about, Palestine and Israel, a lot of times people will mention BDS or the boycott, divest, and sanctions movement. And the whole purpose behind that is to be conscious and aware of where our money is going. So if we're going to operate within this capitalist system, we can at least, at the very least, like the bare minimum we can do is try and be aware of where our money is going and making sure that it's not funding things that we disagree with.
Right. Because a lot of the times we'll get taxed. I'm sure the working class, they look at their paycheck, they see that, hey, this hourly rate that I was guaranteed or signed, 30% of it is gone, 40% of it is gone. Some things are going into Social Security, some of it Medicare, but then there's this big chunk, federal tax, state tax, whatever it is. Then if you own property taxes, what is all that stuff going to? So I think the narrative that, especially on the Republican side or conservative side, is in general that, we should limit the government's abilities and shrink the government and therefore reduce the amount of taxes that people pay. But I think the problem is not with the taxes themselves. It's more so what it's going towards and then who's actually paying it. Yeah. Because what people don't realize is that, yeah, maybe these billionaires have amassed a lot of wealth, whether they started from the absolute bottom or they, were given, wealth early on.
A starter fund.
A small loan of $1 million. Whether that was essentially their path to success, how much taxes do they actually pay? And maybe if you look at it from a total dollar amount, it seems like a lot, but there's something called an effective tax rate that people don't realize. And at the end of the day, what is that effective tax rate? Why are some billionaires, why do they have lower effective tax rates than a lot of middle class or upper middle class folks? Yeah. And then what happens is that the upper class avoids paying the taxes for the lower class, and then the middle class, they pay the taxes for the lower class, and the upper class has essentially made the middle class enemies with the lower class and strive to be the upper class. Right. So
I do think it's, again, when we talk about the kind of turning tide or the shifting tide, this is something that people are becoming more and more aware of. I think in the last probably 15 or 20 years, there has been more of a realization that, oh, wow, like I've been working steadily, I've been working harder than ever before, and yet the amount of money that I'm taking home, it's not like it's gone up considerably or immensely. No, I'm still, living in the same place or driving the same car or able to afford just enough to get by. Why is that, right? Not just that, but beyond that, talking about where our taxes are going. I can pay, happily, I'll pay 20 or 30% taxes, but it would be nice if the schools were operational, if the roads were operational, if my healthcare was affordable. All of these things that you and I recognize are not the reality that we exist in. Yeah. So we can look at, right now it is particularly a flashpoint when we look at Israel, because we recognize this is the number one recipient of foreign aid. They're in the midst of a genocide against the Palestinian people, and we're the ones paying for it. We're the ones contributing our tax dollars to an ethnic cleansing campaign. For me, that's unacceptable, right? I would be, again, happy to pay taxes at whatever rate if I could have any kind of idea or say, any sense of transparency in where that money was going. But sadly, right now, we look at the city we live in or the healthcare costs that we're dealing with or the opportunities that exist in this country, and they're minimal and dwindling. Things are getting worse, despite what Joe Biden might try to tell you in a jobs report. We can look around and day to day recognize, oh, my grocery bill is more expensive than it was a year ago. Gas is more expensive than it was a year ago. Schools are worse off than they were a year ago. Meanwhile, we look at Israel and they're prepared to drop endless amounts of bombs and weaponry because that's what we're paying for. That's where our tax dollars are going. And whereas, 20, 30 years ago, it might have been a fringe belief or kind of outlandish thought that, oh man, like my tax dollars are going towards that. I think nowadays people are really starting to come around to the concept that, oh, like this is exactly what we're doing. This is exactly what our money is going towards. So when Obama can sit on a podcast and comfortably say, we're all equally complicit. We're all responsible for what's happening. Technically, he might be right because of the way our tax dollars are funneled. But who made it that way? I certainly didn't choose where my tax dollars were going. Right. If I had a choice, they wouldn't be going there.
I feel like some people would choose for it to go there, though.
They probably would.
But
I don't think it would be the 100 million or however
very
many
true
people that are paying those taxes.
Very true. I wonder how a approach to taxes would be if, let's say they say, to give an example of a person who makes 100 grand a year, their tax rate is 30% at the end of the day, and easy 30K. You can then pick and choose where you put that 30K. Right. If you're a veteran, you're like, okay, I'm huge on veteran affairs and I want veterans to have care. I can put X amount of money here. Or I'm a big healthcare advocate. I can choose my money here. But instead, the process we have is, hey, I'm going to elect someone who's going to represent me, and they're going to go for all the things that I go for, right? And then when it comes to a little disagreement with that person, and a lot of the times it's a lot of disagreement, you just think, well, I've been a lifelong Democrat, so I'm just going to vote for the Democrat because one or two issues are actually different. Maybe it's abortion, maybe it's climate change, whatever the issue might be. It'll just become a battle of vote for the Democrat because we have to save women's rights.
It's lesser of two evils, right?
It's essentially, that's great, but what about all these other things? No, we're just going to continue to fund Israel. We're going to continue to give you terrible health care. We're going to continue to, not fund your schools and, terrible infrastructure. So we're just going to continue all these things. So that would be an interesting concept if you could decide, all right, fine. This is how much taxes I pay. This is how I decide it gets distributed and allocated.
And again, none of this do I say under some sense of delusion that, by tomorrow or by next year and next year's election, it's going to change. No. But I do think in people asking those questions, it allows us to circle back to, okay, well, if I'm not the one making the decision on where my taxes are going, who is? Right. It's these, purported elected officials, right? The people that we elected that in theory should be representing us. Well, okay, if we get one election every 4 years or every 2 years or however frequently, we probably want to be very careful about who we're choosing to represent us, right? Right. And not just fall behind, this person is blue or this person is red or this person is, we have this one agreement on this one issue or I'm a single issue voter. I don't really think, I think single issue voting has led us to where we are now, and I don't think it's a tenable position. I think it's something that we probably need to shift away from.
And that's why a lot of people have lost their faith in voting altogether, I feel. But I think that's why it's good that you're here because, within your experience of union organizing, I think that's one of the ways, other than voting, that, you can really make a difference with the people that you work with or people that are just looking to make more money, because there's a strong narrative around, if you join a union or if you are part of a union, organize, it's going to screw you over in the long run. So I'd love to tap into your experience with union organizing and how you were able to successfully execute that.
Yeah, I mean, collective action, whether it's union organizing, labor organizing, political organizing, anything, it's always going to be more powerful than any individual, right? Regardless of how loud their voice is, when it's a group of people that can get behind a message, whether that message is, hey, boss, we need more money, or we need better working conditions, or, hey, Nancy Pelosi, or whatever politician.
The greatest trader of all time.
The greatest insider trader of all time, correct. I think it requires us to set aside our individualism, which is really difficult. And again, we can trace that back to capitalism and how capitalism promotes individualism and rewards it. But at what cost, right? Like there are other people that are working beside us or in theory working beneath us that they also need to put food on the table and a roof over their heads and clothes on their back and all of these things. So for me, my experience is relatively limited. I don't claim to be a lifelong organizer or anything like that, but I do recognize that within a workplace, being able to set aside personal differences or generational differences or political differences even, and recognize what is it that we have in common. Within a workplace, in my experience, we were able to recognize, okay, our working conditions are not up to the standard that we are looking for. Our regularity, our scheduling, our pay, all of these things are not at the level that we are looking for. And so regardless of how long a person has worked at a company or how high up they've made it in the company, recognizing that this affects all of us, that's going to be kind of our common cause to be able to unite behind and approach management or approach a politician and say, hey, me and 1,000 of my friends feel a particular type of way. And even though we don't have our ages in common or our race or our backgrounds or our upbringings or our beliefs or whatever, we have this one thing in common, and we're able to unite behind that and provide a message that, this isn't something that we're okay with. So whether that's, again, labor organizing, or particularly right now, when we look at collective action related to speaking out against, certain international political decisions, me calling my elected representative, I can call them every day, every hour. It will not change anything if it's just me.
Yeah.
But when 1,000 people are calling an elected representative, or 1,000 people are taking to the streets, or 100,000 people are going to Washington, D.C. to say, hey, we need a ceasefire today, that message is going to resonate a little bit louder, in my opinion. And history will tell us this. It's not just me, claiming this out of nothing. So being able to, again, I think it traces back to setting aside our individualism and being able to recognize the humanity of another person and say, oh, this is a person who also needs to be able to take care of their family, or needs to be able to look after their kids, or needs to be able to support themselves, even if it's somebody that's by themselves, no family, no nothing. They deserve dignity. They deserve their human rights. They deserve the ability to support themselves. And if we're not looking out for one another, nobody is looking out for us. The people in power are not looking out for us. They've made that very evident. And every day, even more so.
Yeah, it seems like whenever we come together towards a common goal or a common mission, if it's 1 or 2 people, no one's going to budge. If it's 5, 10 people, okay, maybe a little bit of push. But when it's a large population putting pressure on individuals or a situation, I know you're a huge soccer fan, but think of it as, you're all on a team, you're trying to win the game or score a goal. So I think what the narrative has become is, it's red versus blue, or it's single issue, you're divided on this issue, all right, I can't be your friend. Obviously, there's some issues that I feel are a clear-cut litmus test of your humanity, such as the Israel-Palestine conflict. If 4,000 kids have died, and you're just making excuses for it, or not making a...
Or not believing that 4,000 kids have died.
Yeah, where are the numbers?
Right.
Where I'm questioning.
And then what's interesting is that when the numbers are provided, when the names and ages and everything, all the details are provided, again, it's crickets.
Yeah. No, it's just a way to continue to divide us, that there's already these people who are questioning the Palestinian Authority or the numbers that are being provided, and then when you give them the facts, they're just so set on their narrative that has been shaped in their head by the misinformation that they've continuously been fed, that they're going to continue to believe what they're believing. Same thing with people who may be anti-union, that, oh, there was probably a lot of anti-union people that you came across, or that people that you were like, okay, I'm not going to be able to convince this person anymore.
There was hesitation.
Yeah, hesitation. And I mean, at some point, in certain circumstances, you can't blame that individual because of the information that they've been fed. But a lot of the time, you can.
Yeah, I think I always take it back to something that my dad told me when I was a kid, and it always resonated with me. He said, you can wake somebody up no matter how deeply they're sleeping, right? But you'll never wake somebody up if they're pretending to be asleep. So if somebody is convinced that, oh, my argument or my point of view is flawless, it can't be touched, nobody can convince me otherwise, then nothing that I say or do, no amount of experience, no amount of knowledge, no amount of advice, nothing is going to change their mind.
Yeah.
It requires an open mind. It requires an ability to say, like my experiences have led me to believe a certain thing. Maybe that's not the whole story, right? I've been told all my life that people that look this way, or people that talk this way, or people that dress this way are bad or are good. But it probably requires a little bit more digging, or a little bit more of us in general to be able to say, oh, I'm looking beyond a person's appearance or a person's background or a race or religion to be able to recognize the truth or the validity of an argument.
Yeah, which is why in this country there's, so many races. We're quote unquote the most diverse country there is, right? Because we'll have, Black people, Latin rooted people, Mexican. We'll have South Asian, European. Sure. You have basically the whole pot.
The melting pot.
The melting pot. That's what they call us. But it seems that it's reminding me of a specific thought that I had today, that maybe you saw this video of on CNN. There was she was either a nurse or a doctor, but she visited Gaza. And this was before, what's currently happening. But she just gave she was on the show. She was talking about how the Palestinians really treated her with care, and they were the most loyal and loving people. And, she would do anything for the people in Gaza, and she would love to go back, and talking about her experience essentially. And in my head, I was thinking, wow, this is great that, they have someone on her show or on CNN coming on and talking about her experience as a white woman, that, oh, these people, you can trust them. They're not what you make them out to be. But then it also gave me the thought that, why did it take someone who's white, until someone who's white comes on and says these things, you don't take them seriously? Especially, you're looking at people in Congress. Rashida Tlaib, she's talking very loudly, very outspoken, and she might be the only person who's really not holding back anything in terms of calling out the Israeli government for the war crimes that they're committing. But I feel that if she was a white woman instead of a Palestinian woman, they would maybe pay a little bit more attention to her, that, maybe, or maybe not even white woman, white man. If it was just someone who was white not spewing, she's doing great work, saying what she's saying. You know what I'm saying? Like, why did it take until a white woman came on CNN to talk about her experience of, hey, these people that don't look like us, they're actually good people.
They're all right.
They're all right. Like, and that's probably not what was going through her head. But me, as someone who obviously is not Arab, but I can pass. Do I have the Arab card?
You've got it from me.
All right, thank you.
No, I see what you're saying. I think part of me also feels similarly, where, like, why do we need to hear it from somebody who looks a certain way in order to trust it? But at the same time, like, to try and be optimistic, or to try and be collectivist about it, this is a woman who has chosen to use her privilege in a very particular kind of way. So taking her privilege as a white woman who might be trusted a little bit more than an Arab woman or an Arab man or a black person or whatever, she is able to step into a role and still speak for a population and defend a population and try and support a population that she doesn't necessarily identify with.
Right.
So this is, again, we trace it back to setting aside the individualism of, this is my perspective as a white man or as a brown man or as a black, whatever. To be able to say, beyond my identity, like the way I look or where I'm from, these are the facts. These are the things that I believe based on my experience. If we're able to see, again, beyond somebody's skin color or their class or their religious beliefs. If we can. It's a big if, for sure. Yeah. But again, I think we're starting to slowly recognize that incremental change where, the people speaking out for Palestine right now aren't just Palestinians, right? When you go to a Palestine protest today, you'll see Hispanic people, you'll see Asian people, you'll see African people, you'll see people from all across the ideological spectrum, people from all across all different races, backgrounds, beliefs, because they recognize that this is a struggle that's beyond 2 million people trapped in an open air prison. Yeah. This is something that has applied and will continue to apply all around the world. When we look at what's happening in Palestine, you can draw a direct line to what's happening in Atlanta right now. Atlanta yesterday, there were 61 people, protesters, that were indicted on RICO charges, racketeering charges, because they were protesting against what's called Cop City, or a large police compound that they're trying to build in the Atlanta forest. And you can tie these things directly because the police that are training at this Cop City are being trained by Israeli forces. Like this is not, they're not totally unrelated topics. So it's all one common struggle. And as soon as we can recognize that it is a common struggle, it'll make it a little bit easier to be able to stand up and say, hey, even though that topic doesn't directly impact me, I'm not Palestinian, right? My wife is Palestinian. Yeah. Of course, it's near and dear to my heart. I don't have any family in Palestine, right? But it is a cause that is important to me. I don't have anybody in Atlanta that's close to me, no family, no friends as far as I know. But I can recognize, okay, if they're going to build a Cop City in Atlanta, how long until they build one in Chicago? How long until they build one in Durham, North Carolina, where my family is? So all of these issues, as soon as we can recognize and set aside the way that it affects us individually, that's when we'll start to recognize that all of these things are interconnected.
No, it's great that you bring that up. The Chick-fil-A by my apartment, there's a Stop Cop City. Someone put that sign there. I think it has something to do with Chick-fil-A being based in Atlanta, and you're seeing Chicago police getting larger and larger every day, and that budget's going up. And there was probably a lot of hope with the new mayor of Chicago that CPS previously, and he seems like an individual who would have the best interest of the city of Chicago, considering, from the outside perspective, everybody just thinks Chicago is very unsafe or very criminal flooded, right? So with that in mind, I guess it's good that you bring up the point that everything is pretty much connected, because what you can see in Atlanta, you may see in Chicago, and then you might even see it 6,000 miles away. Right. And a lot of people, like I said, they're connecting all the dots right now. So, yeah.
It used to be that when you'd connect all these dots, people would call you conspiracy theorists. They'd say, oh, it's all these string theories and all these things that you're trying to connect. But in actuality, now it's, again, the playing field has kind of been leveled in terms of information. Yeah. If you do a little digging, you follow the money deep enough, you'll recognize that these things are truly connected.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm the type of guy to always tend to drift towards the conspiracy theories rather than see the mainstream news and believe it. But when it comes to the Mourning, I try to read as many as I can, get my information. If the viewers want to sign up for the Mourning, what would you recommend? How would they sign up for your newsletter?
Yeah, so it's on Substack, which is just a writing platform. It's free. It's always going to be a free daily newsletter. Of course, if people want to contribute or donate or what have you, they're more than welcome to. But I've never had any interest in putting up a paywall or in hiding my points of view behind a certain amount of money or a dollar amount. So yeah, I mean, it's again a daily newsletter. Every morning you'll be able to go on and read. It shouldn't take more than 5 or 6 minutes. And again, it includes the links to all the different information that I'm referring to. So if somebody has some questions about whether or not a statement that I've made or something that I wrote is actually true, see for yourself.
Yeah, no, and I really appreciate you coming on and talking about your newsletter. I guess to wrap things up, if someone reads your newsletter, draws inspiration, or they're trying to start something in general, whether it's a newsletter or some sort of creative outlet, how would you recommend someone to pursue that?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think, the hardest part, the biggest hurdle is always starting, right? Because I think so much doubt is self-doubt. We always are our own biggest critics and our own biggest hurdles in starting these endeavors. So you can't be doing it for someone else. You can't be doing it with an audience in mind. It has to be, because it's something that you care about and because it's something that you're passionate about, and that can be beginning, middle, and end. And if, it gains traction, if people like what you're putting out, if it's a podcast, if it's a show, if it's writing, whatever, great. More power to you.
Yeah.
And if people aren't feeling it, but you recognize that it's authentic to you, that's what counts. From my perspective, again, when I first started writing this newsletter, my target audience was me. And eventually, a couple of my siblings or my wife or a couple of my friends expressed interest. Great. I'm happy to share my thoughts with them. And eventually, it's grown slowly and steadily from there. Not to say that it's tens of thousands of people, and no, not at all. It's still relatively small, and I'm perfectly okay with that, because at the end of the day, if people have a critique or a response or a question, the people that are reaching out to me through the newsletter are generally people that I know firsthand or secondhand, people that know me through someone else. So there's a certain level of familiarity or comfort there, which is preferred, in my opinion, to a million people reading. It's kind of this distant, vague figure that they're uncertain about. And then it makes it a little bit harder to verify if this person's acting in good faith. So my advice to anybody, if, whatever creative pursuit, is the first step is just getting started. Whether it's, recording, getting in front of a camera, writing, whatever it is, really pushing yourself to try and start. Because once you get started, once you've, had 2 or 3 episodes, for example, or 2 or 3 entries, whatever it is, you'll find a rhythm, you'll develop a pattern, and it makes it a lot easier going forward to rely on that, as opposed to always kind of building it up in your head as this big, intimidating thing that, I don't even know where I would start, or I don't even know if people would like this, or that. You can question yourself till you're blue in the face. But getting started is, again, really the biggest hurdle.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm definitely going to take that advice for myself too. I mean, just starting out this podcast, I've always wanted to start one, and then something in my head would always tell me no. So I think this is just the beginning of that, and hopefully, your newsletter continues to flourish. I mean, you've been a year strong, and hoping many, many more years if that's what you want to continue.
No end in sight. Yeah.
Yeah, but no,
as long as I got Wi-Fi and as long as I got access to a computer, respectfully, I'm gonna talk my shit.
Talk your shit, bro. Yeah. I appreciate you, Ahmad. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me as a guest. A pleasure and a privilege, to be honest.
Thank you so much.